Dear friends, for the last few weeks, we have been talking about how God does amazing things through normal people like you and me. So 2 weeks ago, we talked about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and how they stood up to King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon and said, "We are not going to worship any God except our own God." And through their courage, God showed his glory, right? He saved them from the fiery furnace, and then King Nebuchadnezzar and all these unbelieving people had to admit that God is powerful and good. Last week we talked about Paul and Silas in the city of Philippi and how through their preaching about Jesus and through their repaying of good, even though that so much evil had been done to them, they repaid evil with good, that God brought many people into his family through them. And this makes sense. Right, even though Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Paul and Silas, even they're centuries apart, they are each solid, good, moral, courageous, devout Christian people. So it makes sense that God is going to work and do amazing things through them. But the people today, not so much. But the people we're talking about today, unlike Paul and Silas, they are not pastors, they are not missionaries, they are not doing church work. In fact, they don't seem to be particularly devout believers in God. Unlike Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they don't strike us as extremely courageous people who put their foot down and make a stand for God. That's not what they do. In fact, they seem pretty comfortable blending into the heathen, un-Christian culture around. In fact, the book of Esther that we're reading today, it's actually pretty unique from all the books of the Bible. The book of Esther does not mention prayer or prophecy or priests or church or worship. In fact, the book of Esther doesn't actually even mention God's name. It's the only book in the Bible that's like that. It doesn't even mention God's name. And yet, we see here that it's one of the things that makes it so beautiful. Because in the story of Esther, we see that even in the darkest times, in the most ungodly places, through the least godly people, God's will is done. God's will is always done. And so the story of Esther is a brilliantly written historical account that takes place during the reign of King Xerxes, who was the king of the Persian Empire. So he reigned from about 486 to 465 BC. And if you remember, we talked about this before, how about 100 years earlier, the Babylonian Empire, which is in modern-day Iraq, they came over to Israel and took all of the Jews, God's chosen people, out of their country to dwell in exile in these refugee camps in Babylon. And decades after that, the Persian Empire, which is in modern-day Iran, they came and they defeated the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, the King Cyrus. He said, well, all you people who are in exile, you can return home. So all the Jews were able to go back to Israel, and so many of them did. But many of them didn't. A lot of the Jewish people stayed. They had built really nice lives for themselves. And so you had all these Jewish people just kind of spread out through the Middle East, including in the city of Susa, which was the winter capital of the Persian Empire, a really important city. And so Mordecai and his cousin, really adopted daughter, Esther, were descendants of some of the Jewish people that decided to stay. Now, what's fascinating about Mordecai and Esther, they're Jews. We think, are probably believers in God. But the name Mordecai, that's not a Jewish name. It actually literally means one who belongs to Marduk. And Marduk was one of the gods of the Babylonians. And Esther actually is related to the goddess Ishtar. And so you have these Jewish people who we think are believers in God, and yet they name themselves after false gods. Okay, well, this is where it gets fascinating. It just so happens that King Xerxes, who at this time is one of the most powerful people in the entire world, his empire at this time spread from India all the way to Ethiopia. And he gets drunk one night and decides that he wants to show off his beautiful wife, Queen Vashti, And so he orders Queen Vashti to come in and to show her beauty to all the officials in his throne room. And he says, you must wear your royal ring, and only your royal ring. And Queen Vashti says, no, I'm not going to do that. Well, you can't just defy the king. And so King Xerxes then deposes her, he divorces her, and she's kicked out of the palace. And so now King Xerxes needs a new queen. And so the talent scouts, the beauty scouts, they go throughout the Persian Empire and find the most beautiful young women that they can find, and they bring them all into the palace. And Esther, this Jewish orphan, is included. And they have trials. Essentially, each of the young women spends a night with the king. And it just so happens that Esther, this Jewish orphan, pleases Xerxes the most. And so she's chosen to be queen of the Persian Empire. Yeah, that's in the Bible. That's in the Bible. And things seem to be going okay. Actually, around this time, too, Mordecai, who seems to have been some sort of mid-level government official in the court of Xerxes, he actually exposes a plot to assassinate Xerxes, so he gets honored for that too. So things are going pretty well until a man named Haman enters the picture. Haman was kind of the right-hand man of King Xerxes, the second leading official of the Persian Empire, someone very powerful, someone very important. And he goes throughout the capital city of Susa on his horse, and people are bowing down to him and praising him. Everyone except Mordecai. Now, why Mordecai refuses to do this, we're not exactly sure. It could have been a religious reason. It could have been just he didn't like him. He didn't think Haman was worthy of respect. Whatever it was, he refused to bow down. And Haman noticed, and Haman was so bothered by it. It didn't matter that all of these thousands of people are bowing down to him and praying, praising his name. No, this one person bothers him so much that it's not just enough for him to kill Mordecai. He wants to exterminate every single man, woman, and child that belongs to Mordecai's ethnic group, and that's the Jews. And so what he does is he goes to King Xerxes and he says, oh, king, there's this group of people in the empire. And they don't respect you, King Xerxes. They don't follow your laws. And it'd be good for the empire if we just got rid of them. And if we do, King Xerxes, well, we'll have 10,000 talents of silver in the royal treasury. That's about 340 tons of silver. And so King Xerxes, he doesn't ask, wait, who are the people that we're going to be exterminating? How many are there? What laws are they breaking? He doesn't ask any of that. He just hears 10,000 pounds of silver in the treasury. That sounds good to me. And so he puts his decree, he puts his royal sign on the decree, which makes it irreversible. And then he and Haman go get drunk as if they didn't just decree a genocide throughout the Persian Empire. And that's where we are in chapter 4. Right, Mordecai and the rest of the Jews throughout the empire, they start mourning publicly because they know all their neighbors are licking their chops, ready to gang up on them and to kill them, their wives, and their children, and take all of their property and to get rich off of them. They have no king, they have no army to defend themselves, and there's no way that this law can be reversed. It was Persian law that if the king said it could not be reversed. And they had no one to go to the king for them and to plead for them, to tell them to stop this, except a young Jewish orphan turned queen named Esther. And so Mordecai sends word to Esther and says, Esther, you need to go to him. You need to beg for us. And Esther says, I can't do that. It's against the law. The law says that if anyone goes to the king's court without invitation, they automatically die. Unless, perchance, the king extends his golden scepter and says it's okay. But that's not going to happen. Why? Because, well, the king hasn't brought Esther into his bedroom for a month. And kings don't spend nights alone. That means that the king was probably sick of Esther. He didn't like her anymore. If she did this, she would die. And Mordecai says, you're going to die anyway. Esther, don't think that because you're the queen, you're going to escape this. Haman is too smart and too powerful, and once he finds out your ethnic identity, that you're a Jew, you'll be killed too. Esther, if you stay silent, someone's going to rise up. Someone's going to save the Jews, but it won't be you, and you and your father's house is going to be destroyed. But then what Mordecai says next is one of the most profound things that we see in this book. He says, Esther, do you think it's possible that it wasn't a coincidence that King Xerxes just happens to get drunk, just so happens to exploit his wife, just so happens to choose you, Esther, out of all these thousands of women that he could have chosen for his queen? He chooses you, Esther. Is it possible that you found this yourself in this position for such a time as this? Maybe this is why you're here, Esther. And so Esther then says, okay, fast for me, which fasting is associated with prayer. So she's essentially saying, okay, pray for me. Pray for me for 3 days. I'm going to go. I'm going to do it. If I perish, I perish. In other words, I'm going to do what's right. God's will be done. And so there's two specific points that I would like to bring out and share with you from this text. The first is this: God's will is inevitable. God's will is inevitable. Think about this. I probably don't have to convince you that God sending the 10 plagues, or parting the Red Sea, or Jesus' miracles, or God working through a pastor to bring people into his church. I don't have to convince you that, hey, God is working in that. God is working through that. I don't have to convince you. That makes sense. But what about a king that just happens to get drunk and just so happens to make this ridiculous request of his wife, just so happens to divorce her, and just so happens to pick this Jewish orphan as his queen out of all the hostile women, just at the time that God's chosen people are in trouble? Is God working through them? The answer is yes. Now, of course, God doesn't will all those bad things that happened, the immoral things that were happening in the Persian Empire. Of course, that's not God's will. But what this certainly means is that good people or bad people, good actions or sinful actions, good times and bad times, everything is working toward God's ultimate will. And everything that happens, God is using for his ultimate will to happen. God's will be done. Mordecai understands this very well. You notice what Mordecai says. Mordecai never tells Esther, you're our only hope. He never says that. He says, Esther, if you stay silent, someone's going to rise. Deliverance is going to rise from the Jews somewhere. Why does he say that? Well, because he probably heard it from the Old Testament, right? God promised Abraham that from your seed, all nations are going to be blessed with the nation that comes from you, Abraham. In order for that to happen, the Jews have to be around. He promises David, there is going to be a king from your line who is going to rule my people forever. Well, in order for that to happen, the Jews have to be around. So Mordecai knew that God's will was going to be done, and yet he tells Esther, maybe God's will is going to be done through you. And that brings us to the second point. While God's will is inevitable, our actions matter. There are some who would say, and Christians do this too sometimes, but where we say, well, because God's will is inevitable, God's will is going to happen, our actions must not really matter. And there are some, even Christians, who would say, well, because our actions matter, God's will must be in the balance. And maybe it'll go this way, it'll go this way. Who knows? God doesn't even know. But the Bible says two things at once. That God's will is inevitable. God's will is sure. God's will is unshakable. It's going to happen. And our actions matter. Well, the question is then, why do we say this prayer, thy will be done? Why do we ask God's will to be done? Well, it's going to be done in him. Right? We're not asking God to do something that he wouldn't normally do. Of course, his will is going to be done. We are submitting ourselves to his will and asking him to make us a part of his will, and that his will be done in us and through us. Really, another reason why God has us ask this prayer. Why does Jesus tell us to pray this? Right? Jesus himself instructed us, hey, say, thy will be done. That's in the prayer that he taught us to pray. Why does he teach us to pray that? Because thy will be done is a prayer that we probably would never let leave our mouths unless Jesus specifically told us to. You think about, of all the things that we could possibly pray, especially in the Lord's Prayer, I would guess that thy will be done is that one part that most of us don't really need. We say thy will be done, but we don't really mean it. Do you realize what you're actually saying? When you say thy will be done, you are actually giving God permission he already has, but you're giving him permission to allow unthinkable pain to enter your life. When you say thy will be done, you are saying, God, you can take my spouse, you can take my children, you can take my family, you can take my friends, you can take my job, you can take my car, you can take my house, you can take my health, you can take my wealth, you can take my prosperity, you can take my status, you can take everything I have, and I will still praise you. I will still love you. I will still trust you, because you are good and your will is good. And when you say, thy will be done, you are saying alongside Esther, I'm going to do what's right. I'm going to do what God asks me, even if I perish. If I perish, I perish. When you say, thy will be done, you are saying, God, I'm going to be honest with my spouse and with my boss, and if I get in trouble, hey, thy will be done. You're saying, I'm going to do what's right, even if I have to sacrifice things I care about. Thy will be done. You're saying, I'm going to tell my friends and family hard things that they need to hear, and if they don't want to be around me anymore, okay, well, God's will be done. Father, I'm going to discipline my children to know you, and if they hate me because of it, and they say, I hate you, and don't want to be around me for a little bit, God's will be done. But you're saying that I'm going to be honest with my customers, my clients, and if that means I lose a little bit of money, well, okay, then God's will be done. And I'm going to speak well of other people, even the co-workers, even if they get promoted and I don't, well, then God's will be done. And you're saying that, God, I'm going to repay evil with good. And I'm going to be honorable, respectful, and kind to people who don't deserve it. And if people think less of me for it, well, then thy will be done. And I'm going to forgive. Those who hurt me, I'm going to forgive, even if it makes me look and feel weak. I'm going to, because this is your will, and if I perish, I perish. Thy will be done. Do you really mean it? When you say, thy will be done, you say it every week. Do you mean it? Well, probably yes and no. Right? There's a part of us that says, yes, I want God's will to be done. I love God. I trust God. I want his will to be done. There's also another part of us that says, no, I don't want God's will to be done. I want my will to be done. I know how my life is supposed to go. I know what I need. Not to cheat, beg, lie, steal to get it. So be it. I can't let God's will be done. If he does, if I put everything to his will, he'll crush me. I can't trust him. Well, that's your sinful nature. That's your old sinful self talking. And I'm here to tell you that voice is wrong. That voice is wrong. How do I know? Because several centuries after Esther, the greater Esther came. Someone else came and approached the king of the universe on behalf of his people. And he said, if I perish, I perish. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus Christ saw what he had to suffer. He knew he had to suffer the wrath of hell, God's anger over every single sin ever committed. And he knew what it would feel like. He knew that it was so painful that his body starts breaking down because he's so petrified of it. And he says, Father, if there's any other way that this can happen, if there's any other way that your children can be brought to you, please let it be done. But not my will, your will be done. And if I perish, I perish. And he did. He perished. He suffered hell itself, eternal death itself, on the cross so that you and I would never have to perish. Think about this. Jesus, the perfect Son of God, perfectly submits himself to the Father's will, like we should have, in our place. And then he goes and suffers the wrath of God in our place so that we would never have to, so that we can submit to God's will and know that God's will for us is that we are in his arms, at his side, with perfect glory and honor and pleasure and joy. That is his will for you. And therefore, everything that he sends into your life, whether it's painful or pleasurable, is ultimately working toward that goal, toward that will. That's his will for you. And that's what the cross means. And because Jesus is resurrected, because he's alive and he's proven that he is all powerful and in control of all things, think about this. Is there anything that Jesus could possibly take away from you in this life that he cannot repay back to you beyond your wildest imagination in the new heavens and new earth? God's will for you is infinitely more beautiful, more wonderful than anything we could ever dream of. Therefore, his will be done. And you know what really cool part about that is sometimes you actually get to see it play out on it. You get to see God's will be beautiful and wonderful even here on earth. Like in the case of Esther. I won't spoil the whole thing. I want you to go home and read the book of Esther because it is so good. So go home, open your Bible, read the book of Esther, but I'll tell you how the story ends. Well, Esther eventually goes into the court of King Xerxes. And, well, again, her life is at stake. And she wonders, is King Xerxes going to just sit there and then I'm going to have to be killed? So she goes, and King Xerxes says, Esther, how's it going? My beautiful queen. Oh, here, what can I do for you? Anything I can do for you? Whatever you ask. Up to half my kingdom, I'll give it to you. What can I do for you? And Esther chickens out. She says, well, okay, I want to throw a banquet for you. Will you drink wine with me? And Haman can come too. Oh, okay, sure. So that's what she does. And then she plans, okay, I'm going to tell him that. Meanwhile, Haman actually thinks he's won. He thinks he's won this whole thing. But he can't wait. He can't wait to kill Mordecai. So what he does is he actually builds this giant pole outside of his house. And the way that they did public execution is they would impale someone on this giant pole and their body would just hang there. And so that pole was specifically for Mordecai. That's what Haman did. That's the first thing Haman wanted to see when he got out of bed in the morning. He had his morning cup of coffee. He wanted to see Mordecai's dead body on a pole next to his house. That's what he wanted. So he had that built. He was ready for it. But first he's got to go to this banquet with Esther and the queen and the king, whatever. Well, Esther is drinking wine with the king. And Haman, and then King Xerxes says, well, what do you want, Esther? What can I give to you? And Esther slowly kind of lets it out and says, my king, there's a plot to destroy my people. And Xerxes says, well, who's behind this? Who would dare do such a thing? And then Esther knows, okay, she's really going to put her life at risk because Xerxes is going to have to take a side. Haman is his right-hand man. Haman is one of the most powerful people in the kingdom. Xerxes can't get another Haman. He can get another queen really easily. He can just get rid of Esther and get another woman. He can't get another Haman. And so she's hoping that maybe he'll take her side against Haman. Well, she says, well, it's Haman. Haman is the one who is trying to destroy my people. And Xerxes is so angry that anyone would dare do this to his queen that he gets up, he storms out of the room because he's so angry. And then Haman actually starts to beg for his life to Queen Esther because he realizes that he's done. And while he's doing that, he actually trips on himself and falls on top of Esther right as Xerxes is walking in the door. And Xerxes says, how dare you assault my queen in my palace while I'm out of the room? And Xerxes decides, well, I'm not going to wait to kill you. You need to be executed today. Today you're going to die. And one of the servants comes in and says, well, my king, there's a perfect hole actually right outside of Haman's house. We could put Haman on. You can't make that up. Don't tell me God doesn't have a sense of humor. You see what this means? God's will is going to be. And there's two approaches that you can take to God's will. You can be like Haman, And you can rebel and fight against God's will all you want, but eventually you're going to end up on your own point. We can be with that like Esther. Do what's right. God's will be done. And it will all work out. And because of what Jesus has done, and because his will for you is infinitely more beautiful than anything you could ever dream of, we can say, thy will be done with joy and confidence. Amen.